Today, what we do is we send a copy of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative model, our Canadian version, together with the copy of the charter, and we insist that the researchers make a line item in their budget for dealing with the patient group and the patients. So if they have to have that as a line item in the budget, they will take it more seriously and consult with that patient group all the way through the process, and not just fictionally check the box.
Hi, I'm Costas.
Hi, I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. Today we have another very special guest with us today. We have Barry Stein with us. So thank you very much, Barry, for jumping in and being a guest on this podcast. A little bit about Barry before we jump right in. Barry is the CEO and president of Colorectal Cancer Canada. He is what we would probably call a super patient advocate and has devoted really his entire life to supporting patients in their fight against cancer. So Barry sits on many boards, including Colorectal Cancer Canada, the Donald Berman Foundation, Tikva Children's Foundation, Quebec Clinical Research in Oncology, or QCROC, Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network, or CFIN, and last but not least, he's also on our board as well at Exactus Innovation. So thanks again, Barry, for joining us today. And, maybe the first question for you, Barry, is you have a very long and interesting history, obviously, with cancer. So maybe if you can just start off by letting us know a little bit about your journey on building Colorectal Cancer Canada.
Thanks so much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here and to tell you a little bit about the work that we do and our engagement, but also my personal story. So actually, starting in 1995, I was just practicing law, as any young lawyer would do with a young family here in Montreal. And I seemed to have some signs and symptoms of something. I didn't know what it was, but ultimately did a colonoscopy and found that I had colon cancer. And not only did I have colon cancer, but it had spread to my liver. And subsequently, I found out that it had also spread to my lungs. So it was a challenging time in Quebec, as it is now, in order to get timely access to the appropriate care. Of course, at that time, we only had one drug called 5-FU in order to treat colon cancer, which had been used for about 40 years with limited success. And my cancer had already metastasized, so it was stage 4. Had trouble in Montreal getting surgery and ended up in a timely manner and ended up having to leave the country and have my first of several liver surgeries, which was actually uncommon in itself to chase cancer at that time through surgery in New York City. And followed up each surgery with a PET scan, which is something that was almost unheard of in Canada, except in 2 centers and mostly for research purposes. But after 4 surgeries on my liver in New York, which was quite incredible, even just by saying that to people at that time. Today, it's relatively commonplace to have multiple liver surgeries. And then having done an experimental vaccine out in California, I found that I had no evidence of disease. So a lot of work went into that and started with some very basic chemotherapy, the 5-FU, and started some trials in Montreal, in addition to the vaccine trial that I did out in California. So that was my first sort of integration into clinical trials, or learning about clinical trials and getting that started actually in the year 2000, when all the computers were going to crash and we had to write special protocols because the world was coming to an end as the clock swept 12 into the new year. But of course, nothing happened, and a lot of work went into that. And unfortunately, after doing all that hard work, I found that it had actually metastasized to my lungs. So started getting the trials going here in Canada on oxaliplatin at the time, and proceeded with some lung surgery. But as you can imagine, having left the country for this surgery was very, very expensive. And I ended up having to sue the Quebec government, RAMQ, for reimbursement for an extensive amount of money for these surgeries, and ultimately won those cases in the Superior Court, and it became a landmark decision for out-of-country healthcare. And so I was launched into the world of advocacy, just trying to cure myself, but then found myself in the middle of litigation, which fortunately turned out well. And the surgeries turned out well, so I was able to pursue not only my law career at that time, but the beginning of what became Colorectal Cancer Canada, Canada's Colorectal Cancer Patient Association. So then, after that, in 1998, actually, I should have started off by saying, I think I said maybe that I was 40 at the beginning. I just turned 41. And today we sort of reflect on that and saying, well, that's unusual, but the fastest growing cohort of colon cancer patients today, or colorectal cancer patients today, is that subgroup. It's something that we didn't think about. We just said, well, for some unexplained reason, this person at 40 years old, or 41, just turning 41, had colon cancer, and it just seemed like an anomaly. Whereas today, we see, that there may be some other reasons for it, and we're doing research to the microbiome and so forth in order to understand the causes. But in 1998, we started what at that time was Colorectal Cancer Association of Canada, with some of the grandfathers of oncology in Canada, Tony Fields and Jean Maroon in Ottawa, Tony Fields in Alberta, and a wonderful group of volunteer board. And we grew our organization from there. Today, it's the leading colorectal cancer patient-led organization in the country, and we do a lot of work internationally as well, both in the obvious areas that touch the public at large for prevention, in terms of screening programs and getting those started across the country. And we still are working on Quebec and Nunavut to get those going, but working in the National Colorectal Cancer Screening Network to do that. And then everything through the patient journey, as you would say, from diagnosis all the way through treatment until either survivorship or palliative care for end of life. So these are some of the areas that we work in, but we also work nationally in two other trajectories, and one is in the drug development and diagnostic development area. So everything from ideation of a clinical trial to the recruitment, retention, development of protocols, following the patients through clinical trials, patient preference studies, collection of real-world data and real-world evidence, so that we can submit this type of information back to health technology assessment bodies such as CADTH and INESS, in order to ensure that patients across the country have equitable access to the latest advances and treatments that are also the most effective ones. And then we, of course, get involved in areas in our third trajectory of general health policy in Canada. And that might be access, for example, to molecular profiling, or questions as to what might impede the development of clinical trials in Canada or research in Canada, such as changes to the Patent and Medicine Price Review Board, or the time to patient, for example, the time it takes for a drug to go through the regulatory and HTA process, so that patients can get it on the formulary until they get that actual drug, which can take a couple of years, actually, until it goes through that process. But by and large, we're also really focused on some of the new precision medicines in colon cancer, but in cancer in general. And in order to do that, we're very focused on the way clinical trials are done, the need for different types of clinical trials, because through molecular profiling, we can look at smaller and smaller subgroups of patients. And in order to get those patients, we need a more decentralized approach, an umbrella type of approach. We need to see new types of adaptive trials that could be utilized in order to access some of these new precision medicines, and then look at the regulatory and HTA bodies and talk about conditional acceptance of these type of new products subject to the collection of real-world data. So it really is a big circle of work that has to be done, from initiating and ideating the clinical trials to collecting the data, understanding how we could put real-world evidence frameworks within the clinical trial so that it's followed up post-trial, and also collect those patient preferences along the way.
It sounds like Colorectal Cancer Canada is involved in so much. And there are so many things to get involved in, everything from the clinical trial perspective, how do patients go through that journey and helping them go through that journey, to the regulatory and reimbursement issues. So Barry, how has Colorectal Cancer Canada decided where they think that they're going to have the biggest impact? Where is the highest focus, let's say, on what could be done to improve cancer care for Canadian patients?
So that's really an excellent question, Costas. So there's not one specific single answer to that question, because we live in a really dynamic atmosphere today. Certainly on the prevention side, we're very focused on bringing in the programmatic approach to colorectal cancer screening in general. So there's no question about that. But as we start entering the world of precision medicines, then we're starting to get into the broader field of cancer, not just colon cancer per se. And as we see these new precision medicines and immunotherapies coming to use around the world, we recognize the lack of ability to screen for those particular people that might have these certain mutations that these precision medicines can target specifically. And that started some work, for example, that we prioritized in terms of molecular profiling. So I entered the steering committee. I became part of the steering committee for the Beat Cancer Coalition and worked globally on an international basis with something called FT3 on the board of FT3 from testing to targeted treatments, so that we can not only get the Canadian perspective, but a global and international perspective of what's going on in different countries and how we can learn from other countries or adopt some of those strategies in order to have equitable access in the country. And then we worked with some of our pharma partners and other partners. So we worked together in a program with Pfizer and Thermo Fisher in order to see, can we get molecular profiling done in the community and non-academic centers, and started to understand the issues that go along and really how problematic that is actually. And whereas at the beginning we were screaming everybody has to have equitable access to profiling, and we still firmly believe in that, we now recognize the challenges involved in getting that done. So in the prevention side, that's pretty clear. But as we start dealing with precision medicines, we started to look deeper. And as we looked deeper, what we found was that a lot of these precision medicines that were coming down were not going to be approved, and Canadians were not going to get access to them. So we took a look at that and we deconstructed the situation. We said, okay, why are these products not going to be accepted? And by and large, they more easily made it through the regulatory side, but on the health technology assessment side for reimbursement, it became problematic because a lot of these products, we weren't going to see phase 3 trials for an extended period of time. It could be 20 years before they would have enough people participating in a trial that we could see this. So we had to try to reimagine, okay, well, what is the problem, and take it apart. And we started to work with our researchers and understand that we need a different type of trials, basket trials, for example, that in order to find these patients all over the world. A good example was in larotrectinib, which is an NTRK fusion drug that's not specific to any one particular cancer, but multiple cancers. And there's never going to be a phase 3 trial on that for maybe 20 years if we're lucky. And how would that get through HTA? Because we knew, having spoken to patients, not just in colorectal, but in other areas, disease sites, that this was having a huge impact. So when it worked, it really, really worked for these people and took it from almost certain death to fully functionable and almost cured a situation. So we, as I said, we deconstructed and we said, what has to be done? So we worked with the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network, or I worked with them more appropriately on their board, and understood that maybe there is a way to develop a conditional approval process. And we tried to bring Health Canada and CADTH on board. And then through Roche and CFIN, they worked with BC Cancer in developing a program called PREDICT in order to try to look at ways that they could gather that type of evidence, real-world evidence, so that they could give early acceptance to products in situations such as the archetype of allarotrectinib, where there would only be phase 2 data at most. So that kind of sort of opened the doors. And then at Exactus Innovation, on the board there, we started to see personalized my treatment. Again, more molecular profiling being done to identify patients who either could get on a clinical trial for their treatment or who could be matched with a specific treatment. And again, that fit really well into the fold of better understanding precision medicines and how patients could access them. And as we started to see that, we said, well, how are patients going to get access to this? They're not getting them approved so quickly. Let's look at clinical trials. And that became a priority. So from molecular profiling and precision medicines, we said, well, we better understand better how patients could get into clinical trials. What about clinical trial navigation? Who's navigating on behalf of patients? How do we encourage industry to invest more in research in Canada? And we formed an advocacy group among researchers, the Canadian Health Research Forum, and we brought OICR, Atlantic Institute of Cancer Research, and Exactus, and others together, CQDM and others, in order to advocate for ways to actually encourage research in cancer in Canada. And at that point, it was countered by the proposed changes at the Patent and Medicine Price Review Board. And we advocated with government for doing more investment in research, which happened to come about nicely as well. So that became a priority. In other words, as we started to I mentioned that it's a dynamic situation. As we investigated and we deconstructed why patients weren't getting an access to certain drugs, we started to take it apart and go back all the way to the clinical trial stage and say, real-world evidence frameworks, patient preference studies, follow up with real-world evidence data, access to molecular profiling, and so on and so forth. And of course, there are many other things that came out of that, and started to identify partners around the world where we could really develop some of those initiatives, among others.
It sounds like the patient is always at the center of how you approach what needs to get done, and I think it's a great way to look at it, because it's the one continuity across the entire landscape, that the patient is always in the middle trying to figure things out and always impacted by these decisions. But it's a fresh way of taking a look at how do you start to prioritize and tackle a lot of these issues that get in the way of really treatments for patients.
So it's funny you should say that the patient is at the center, because as we got into this, we also developed a clinical trials conference. Unlike most clinical trials conference, it's really quite multidisciplinary. This year, our 7th annual clinical trials conference will focus on bringing clinical research to clinical practice. And we'll look at worldwide trends, such as happened with the recovery trial for COVID, and bring in some people from the National Institute of Health in the UK, a research institute, to discuss this as well. But from this clinical trial group, we developed something called PACT, or Patient-Centered Approach to Clinical Trials, which is a beautiful group of individuals and organizations that are very focused on patient centricity in clinical trials, from the ideation of the trial to the development of the protocol, throughout the clinical trial continuum and post-trial, and looked at that. And this group continually works throughout the year on different aspects, whether it's in clinical trial navigation or otherwise. And one of the things that we developed was something called the Canadian Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. So following what Duke University had done in the FDA in the United States, we Canadianized a model showing how patient groups and patients could and should be involved in the clinical trial continuum in order to enhance clinical trials and ensure that they really met the needs of the patient. And from that group, we also developed a charter of 5 basic tenets, which included things like transparency and bringing in and educating the patient group and teaching the researcher to work together with patients and researchers together, the follow-up with real-world evidence, and so forth. And these tenets can be found actually Colorectal Cancer Canada.ca is one of our sites, but we also have pactcanada.org. I actually think I said our website wrong. It's colorectalcancercanada.com, okay, and it's pactcanada.org, P-A-C-T, Canada.org. And on there, you could see those tenets in the charter and so forth. And now we're working to see how we can pilot that charter by getting pharmaceutical companies and academic researchers to employ the model where they work together with patients and patient groups in order to inform clinical trials and bring back that information, even post-trial, to regulatory and HTA bodies. So the patient centricity is really first and foremost what PACT does, and we work with pharma companies around the world, and we see, well, maybe they don't actually have the same understanding as patient centricity as we do. So, for example, in one large pharmaceutical company, they have a group that works on patient centricity and another that works on clinical trials, and those two are two separate groups, but really they should be working hand in hand right from the very beginning of the ideation of the clinical trial. And that's what we're trying to get them to do.
Great. Thanks a lot, Barry. Actually, this is a completely crazy, naive question I'm going to ask you here. Probably, maybe it's obvious to Costas and yourself, but maybe bear with me here. It seems like a no-brainer to me that you would kind of construct a clinical trial via this patient centricity approach, right? It seems like a no-brainer. I guess maybe if you could speak to why do you think that has not been traditionally the case, and why it's so important to make sure that the patient voice is incorporated into clinical trials? Maybe that would help.
That's an excellent question, and I would say that more and more it's certainly an initiative of big pharma to try to make their trials more patient-centric, and how they do that is perhaps by speaking to a patient or a couple of patients in order to inform it. But by bringing in the patient group, you retain that institutional memory. You bring back the input of many patients, not just one patient. And that one patient who is involved in a clinical trial could be, and I'm not talking about the participant now, I'm talking about the patient advisor to the trial, needs the support and education in terms of health literacy and so forth, and understanding about a clinical trial and the things that can be gathered in a clinical trial, such as patient preferences and so forth, need to work together with the patient group in order to accomplish that goal, and to help to work together with the researchers who are not used to working with patients and with patient advisors and so forth, and then to retain that information and bring that back at later stages, which could be several years later, when often the patients who participated in the trial themselves are not around. Because let's face it, most patients who participate in clinical trials in cancer are at their later stages. They've had all other treatments exhausted, and now they're trying a clinical trial, which is something that should change and hopefully will change. But that's the way it is now. So patient groups can really offer that added value by not only helping all the way through the clinical trial continuum, but post-trial in order to collect data, but also to inform both regulatory and more particularly the HTA bodies. So you would think that, yes, it is a no-brainer that this should be happening, but it's also costly. And it's not also what pharma is used to doing on a more independent basis, and not necessarily in the past being so transparent with all the results and sharing, so openly. But the world is changing, and these principles, at least I think, are being accepted and adopted, if not fully implemented yet, by industry and the academic trials. And speaking of academic trials, we know that in some of the granting agencies, they always require, a patient input or patient advisor to it. But very often, that's almost like checking the box and a request for letter of support and so forth, and then you never hear from the researcher. Well, today what we do is we insist, in order to ensure that this is a reality, we send a copy of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative model, our Canadian version, together with the copy of the charter, and we insist that the researchers make a line item in their budget for dealing with the patient group and the patients. So if they have to have that as a line item in the budget, they will take it more seriously and consult with that patient group all the way through the process, and not just fictionally check the box.
So we talked a lot about the traditional approach to developing evidence for reimbursement, for informing how do you treat patients going forward. And that's the clinical trial. One of the things that we're interested in, obviously, is how do we incorporate real world evidence into that sort of decision-making rubric. And I think the question for us here is, how do we best incorporate the patient perspective in that type of evidence? Oftentimes it's retrospective in nature. I think the most commonly used is administrative data, which was really never meant for research. It was meant for tracking costs, right? So it's how do we take real world data and really utilize it in a way that brings the patient to the forefront, or is it already baked in, being real world data? So I think for me, I'd love to sort of understand what your perspectives are on RWE and where the patient's perspective fits in.
That's a really great question and not an easy question to answer, because it is evolving. But I can say that, very often what we're used to seeing is people looking, or companies, people who submit to HTA, looking for, at the very last minute, the patient perspective, at the reimbursement level. And we're used to, a 40-day window in order to gather information from all over the world and submit it, within that window of opportunity to the body for expert committees for consideration. Whereas, obviously, it makes more sense to start at the time of clinical trial. You have to look back. You have to gather it over a longer period of time and follow the patient through. And you have to also consider that this may even evolve. One of the reasons why HTA bodies are so troubled is because of the uncertainty of a clinical trial, right? You have a very select group of people who participate in the clinical trial, a very the endpoints are maybe limited, or they may be so far off that they don't even consider them to be valid endpoints. And really, when we talk about patients, what is a data set that we're looking at in terms of what we gather? It's not just their PROs, their patient-reported outcomes, but we're looking at their preferences as well. What are their values? So, for example, We just completed our first phase of a patient values project together with the University of Calgary in patient preferences. And we understand that there's a big difference between what the population, our citizens, think, between what metastatic patients may think and non-metastatic patients may think, and their caregivers may think. And when we measure, for example, overall survival benefit versus quality of life, we may get different answers to that question in different circumstances by these different groups. So it's really important to understand what the needs of the patients are, depending on where they are also in their treatment as well and what they've gone through. So we can't do that in 40 days or 30 days. This is almost impossible to do, notwithstanding our best efforts and to do that. And if we start early and work together with the researchers and truly try to understand not just the side effects and the outcomes in patients, the patient-reported outcomes, but also what their preferences and values are, that it would make a huge difference. So what good, for example, is a drug or a medicine that causes certain side effects that the patient will never adhere to taking that drug? And you find that out at the end. Wouldn't it be obviously much more important to find that out at an early stage? And perhaps maybe it's as simple as changing, maybe not so simple, but changing the mode from an oral therapy to an IV therapy or vice versa, if possible. But maybe it's not so easy to do, but recognizing, these issues or preferences early on can make a big difference in whether or not a drug is approved and the adherence to the drug by the patient.
Yeah, so Barry, that's a very interesting concept about the not just overall survival being the endpoint, but patient preference being a potential, let's say not endpoint, but what's the best way, a something complementary to these traditional endpoints. Like how would like CADIF, how would INES, how would they think about this? Because the way that I guess the example I'm thinking about in my mind, and you can kind of completely change this example, Barry, is that I assume that if there's someone who is much older in life, let's say they're 90 years old, maybe they really, really highly want quality of life because they know that they don't maybe have many years left. So for them, the highest value, the thing the most important to them is quality of life. Whereas let's say you have someone in like 30 that has a family, just a young kid, right? Just got married, whatever it may be, has their life ahead of them. They see, okay, I want to take every chance possible to lengthen my lifespan, right? I'm willing to suffer a little bit of quality of life right now in order to get that edge, right, or that chance. So how do you think we should think about it from that rubric? Because those preferences are very different, right? They're almost like extreme opposites. So how does one even think about modeling this type of concept?
So I do think that CADIF in particular and INES are interested in that. I think they are looking at the various endpoints and more interested in patient preferences. I was actually just with both CADIF and INES in Australia at the Health Technology Assessment International meeting, and the strong component of that meeting was about patient preferences. So there is a very strong interest in it. The problem is, how do they evaluate it and what are they comparing it to? And that's where they have a lot of challenges right now in terms of integrating patient preferences into the HTA process. And I could tell you we've interviewed through our HTAI PCIG PP group, so that's the Health Technology Assessment Patient Citizen Involvement Group in Patient Preferences. We have actually interviewed 40 HTA bodies around the world, many of which were in Canada, and all are interested in incorporating patient preferences, and most of them have no clue on how they can do that. And this is really where we're at today. So a strong interest in doing it and not quite sure how to integrate it. And of course, the situation that I could really give is, sometimes you have a product, and it could be a device as well, that does not seem to be so cost effective. Or for one reason or another, there may be more morbidity to one procedure over another, but yet for a specific reason, the patient preference is counters that. So, for example, there was a heart device that was looked at, and from all intents and purposes, from an HTA point of view, it seemed like there was no reason that this device would be given reimbursement. Certainly, there was more mortality with the device. It was expensive, and so on. And then the patient preference part of it was they didn't want this. They would have preferred, as opposed to the open surgery, they preferred to have this device, which was less invasive. They were prepared to pay money for it. They were prepared to travel distances in order to obtain it. And the patient preference for this device was much stronger than the evidence for the clinical benefit and the cost effectiveness of the product. And that real world evidence actually convinced the HTA body to reimburse the product. So the patient preferences added more to the conversation. I wish I could say that could happen more often, but I think that that's a good reason to explore this area more, and why it's so important to better understand how these patient preferences can be incorporated into the decision-making process by the expert committees who are not experts in this area at this point.
Yeah, a question for you, Barry, because you went on the patient preference. This is completely a sidebar, and it's primarily because I read something online, so I'm curious about what your thoughts on it is. You talked about screening colorectal cancer patients. Asymptomatic individuals for potentially colorectal cancer as something that you is a primary huge focus of Colorectal Cancer Canada, which makes sense. You screen, you hopefully catch things early, you can treat then earlier and better outcomes. Now, there's a huge amount of interest around these blood-based tests that are potentially coming down the line that can detect ctDNA or circulating tumor DNA earlier. So the idea that you can catch these type of cancers earlier, and most of the work seems to be done in colorectal cancer. I'm curious from your perspective, it seems like the alternative is this so-called FIT test, right? And to me, the FIT test seems to be easier to do than the blood-based test. It's less invasive than the blood-based test, where you take some stool sample and get that tested. Why does it seem like there's a patient preference for the blood-based tests? Have you looked into this area? That seems to be a huge, at least for some of the vendors of these blood-based tests now, that's the thing that they're hanging their hats on, is this patient preference, that they say patients prefer our test over this other test, even though this other test is cheaper, also more effective as well.
So I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a lot of confusion on many of the things that you brought up. So let's just start off with a couple of definitions. And one is what screening is. So screening is you just turned 50 years old, right? And you're asymptomatic, you have no signs, no symptoms, and we want to see, is there any blood in the stool? Which might be an indication that there's a polyp or cancer or something there to be followed up on. And that's a simple home-based stool test where you poop in the toilet, you take a little stick into the poop, it goes into a test tube, and it's sent to the lab looking for essentially blood in the stool. And if positive, you do a colonoscopy. There are, in fact, in early development, but none which have really realized any potential as a screening tool in broad use. Some blood-based tests where they take a blood sample from your arm and they analyze it. Now, we have no blood tests now that have been approved in Canada and that are utilized for that. But then you mentioned ctDNA. So let's talk about ctDNA, or circulating tumor cells, which is a little bit different. So the first is, do you have in prevention something that would lead us to suspect that there's a polyp, and you proceed with a colonoscopy after any of these tests, whether blood tests or FIT tests or any other test that's done? For example, in the United States, they have a Cologuard, a DNA test. Any of those tests If positive, lead to a colonoscopy. ctDNA, which may one day be used as a screening test, but not now, is a little bit different. It's used in order to search for circulating tumor cells after you have had surgery, primarily for stage 1 and stage 2 cancers, and to see, is there any circulating tumor cells, little microscopic cells floating around in your blood, that if they're there, then perhaps you should continue and do some adjuvant treatment or preventative treatment with chemotherapy or other targeted therapies, as the case may be. But generally, chemotherapy, either FOLFOX or FOLFIRI, plus or minus bevacizumab in some cases, and usually it's FOLFOX. Depending if it's just stage 1 or stage 2, it'll be one or the other. So it's used as a test to determine whether or not to proceed with a treatment to prevent the recurrence of the disease. Of late, they're looking at it even in later stage disease for the same reasons. Is there a recurrence of a disease for metastatic disease, and should a ctDNA test be used? There's a couple on the market right now. We used to have a Canadian homegrown one, Connexia. I'm not sure that's still available in the United States and available in Canada by self-pay. There's the Natera Signatera test. So there are these ctDNA tests, and in the United States, there's some big institutions have developed their own testing for that similarly. But it's still not in common use. It's rather expensive for the average patient to be used, and I think it's just entering prime time. It's not quite there yet, just entering, but it is used, and it is very exciting avenue to look at, because it can perhaps prevent the recurrence of a disease post-surgery in early stage cancers, and might even be able to be used as a tool for when to restart treatment later on in metastatic disease as well, post-surgery. So quite exciting, but very important to distinguish between the screening, no signs, no symptoms, you're just an average person walking around, and those who had surgery for colon or rectal cancer, and the testing to see whether or not to restart treatment.
Terrific. Thanks, Barry. We don't want to take too much of your time today. I know you are spread pretty thin at a lot of meetings, and you're getting ready next week to go to ESMO, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe I'll leave with that. What are you looking forward to for ESMO this year?
Well, it's an interesting question. ESMO is coming up, but I'm also pre-ESMO meetings. I'm meeting with FT3 to talk again about molecular profiling and access to molecular profiling for precision medicines. And then at ESMO, we're looking to do a few things. We're looking actually to see the follow-up on Natera and the Signatera test. We're looking to see a couple of new therapies that are out there, that whether it's some reporting on the results from these new therapies that are looked at as, again, late-stage alternatives to some of the treatments that are out there. And I noticed that there's a couple of presentations by some Canadian oncologists that are going to be made there too. So hooking up with our partners, our researchers there, other patient groups is an essential part of these meetings. Apart from the learnings from the sessions themselves, really the networking is paramount to bringing information back to Canadian patients for their benefit.
So great. Thanks a lot, Barry. Thank you very much, Barry, for joining us today, and of course for all the great work that you do on behalf of patients. And I think everyone in Canada and probably across the world owes you a great debt. So appreciate your efforts. So everyone, if you like this episode, please comment below, like, subscribe as well. And of course, if you have any feedback for us, feel free to put them in the comments below. So thanks a lot for joining another episode of What's with RWE.